it's better to be wrong for the right reason than it is to be right for the wrong reason. If something like COVID happens and you follow all of the best literature from Harvard Medical School, from Johns Hopkins, all the other universities that research, that have the best people in the world, where else do you go for advice about this? People are looking at like, I'm not going to believe in that stuff because my politician told me that it's all nonsense. Why in the world would you believe them? It doesn't mean that it's always going to be right. And if they happen to be wrong and I followed them, then I am wrong for the right reason.
How do young men like us optimize our lives in a way that lets us achieve success and meaning? Come with me as I interview top performers and delve into key areas of life: habits, finance, psychology, health, relationships, work, creativity, and business. I boil the ocean of men's advice into usable wisdom in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today is a doctor of social psychology who has spent more than a decade learning the realm of critical thinking. A self-help evangelizer turned skeptic, he now spends his time exploring the importance of arriving at the truth, not feel-good mantras. Being a successful exited entrepreneur has given him the time to explore his curiosity and promote the ideas that further human flourishing. Dr. Bo Bennett, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Blake. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to spend a good portion of today's discussion talking about this idea that you've come up with or attempted to repopularize, and that's positive humanism. Can you give me a quick rundown of what positive humanism is?
Sure. Positive humanism, you can find it at the intersection of positive psychology and humanism. So positive psychology is the positive part of psychology, where psychology normally focuses on mental illness, health conditions, things that are wrong with the human condition. Whereas positive psychology focuses on what's right with the human condition. It focuses on well-being, how to make us a better person, how we could live the best, most productive lives we can. Not just adequate lives, but fantastic lives. That's what really attracted me to positive psychology. And then on the other side, you have humanism. Humanism really is more of a philosophy than a science. It's sort of sits in there with religion, but it's non-religion in that there's no leader, there's no supernatural involved. It is a philosophy of morality, of how people get along and so forth. And it's really focused on the human being the center as opposed to some deity, which most religions are focused on as the center of the religion. So you take the humanism and you take the positive psychology, put them together, you focus on the positive aspects of humanism as opposed to the political, the negative, the bashing of religions or what have you. And there is a place for all of that. Trust me, there's certainly a place for that, but not with positive humanism. It's just a really positive type of philosophy that does focus on scientific aspects of psychology and humanism.
So you wrote this collection of essays turned into a book about positive humanism. And in the book, you make the case that a lot of religion is the middleman between humans and well-being. And what positive humanism is trying to do is cut out this middleman of religion. And I think that's really effective for the type A personalities like you and I, who have the high agency, who have the critical thinking skills to be able to work their way from the human being, the self, whatever you want to call it, to this end goal of well-being. But I think what I've seen sort of happen is people have abandoned religion in favor of some form of atheism and didn't quite realize that they don't necessarily have the critical thinking skills to arrive at the well-being portion. So we've sort of thrown out the middleman without being able to lead people in an effective way to this well-being endpoint. Is there a way that we should be approaching this? How can we work on bringing more people into this idea with us as the middleman instead of a religion? Or is there just a place where religion has to exist for this portion of people who don't necessarily have the fully set of reasoned critical thinking skills to be able to arrive at this end goal?
That's a good question. And it's one that I guess I would take a more positive view on, that I don't think humanity is doomed and we have to fall back to the supernatural because we're not smart enough in order to activate some critical thinking. Critical thinking at its core isn't that difficult. The key component of it is actually just deliberate thinking. Whereas most of our thinking would be what cognitive psychologists call system 2 thinking. We just kind of hear it. It goes through one ear, out the other, over our head, whatever. We're not really digesting it. We're taking it in, but we're not processing the information. This happens a lot because, frankly, it takes very little cognitive energy to just take in some information and accept it or reject it by default based on our personal biases. So, for example, if we are a Republican, we hear some kind of Democratic news that's positive to the Democrats, we may automatically just reject it. And that takes no energy whatsoever. And it takes no cognitive skill. It's just something that automatically happens kind of at the subconscious level. It takes very little energy. So fewer calories are burned and maybe we'll gain some weight. Who knows? And that's what we try to do as human beings. We try to conserve energy because we have evolved on this earth to conserve as much energy as possible. Our brain takes up a huge portion of energy these days, at least for most people. So our brain's always in that mode where it wants to process information as little as possible. Critical thinking is really about processing that information, making a deliberate attempt to take an information, think about it, process it, kind of think about our thinking, which we call metacognition, and then come to a good reasoned conclusion based on that. So it's really kind of a process that we all do, like everybody does it, just not often enough. So I think the capability is there for everybody to do this. So going back to religion, I don't think that we all need to resort to 2,000-year-old, 6,000-year-old, whatever religions. And back then, just remember where we were as a people. We were in a completely pre-scientific age where we didn't understand anything scientifically, or very little. I know there were some things that even impress us today, but for the most part, it was practically nothing compared to where we are today. So in order to explain things like even just basic things like earthquakes, we had to resort to the supernatural. We had to make up something because people, we don't like for things not to be explained. We would rather have some answer, even though it's nonsense, as opposed to no answer for the most part. So one aspect of critical thinking is you have to kind of make a pact with yourself and say, look, from now on, I'm okay of accepting I don't know as an answer, as opposed to just making something up or accepting some wild fairy tale or some supernatural explanation for something that has never been proven. And I guess technically by definition never can be proven if it's the supernatural. So you need to be comfortable with that. And I think that we all have the ability to do that. It's just, we have to start doing it more and we have to encourage that. I don't think right now that it's a very popular notion to encourage critical thinking. And that probably gets into a political side of things, like why the leaders or those in power wouldn't want the people they're trying to lead to really get down in critical thinking. It usually doesn't benefit them. It benefits us, the people.
Yeah, I think I want to sort of tie this back to a couple of newsletters. I'm so glad that I was able to have you on because this is like perfectly in the realm of what I find fascinating. And ones that I wrote a couple of weeks ago just ties into this idea of critical thinking. And I just titled the newsletter, What If Everything You Think is Objectively Wrong? And it hits on this point that you were making about how we had a definitive answer for everything. And then over time, every single one of those things has moved. And this sort of gets into part of the next thing about this positive humanism idea, and that's that morality, in your view, is almost somewhat democratic or temporal in nature. And I was wondering if you could touch on that a little bit.
Love the topic of morality. I just want to start by saying that it's so interesting. And what's most interesting about it is if you look at every version of morality that's ever been proposed, you could always pick holes in it. There's nothing that's perfect. Like there's no perfect morality. There are always problems with it. But that doesn't mean that they're not true, because who says morality is perfect? Nobody said that. I think maybe people might claim that, but that's not the case. So it's a matter of picking the morality that you feel works best. And if you could explain it, why and why you support it, I think that's what's most important.
Can you sort of explain the democratic or temporal nature?
Basically, what if everybody decided at one point that murdering babies was okay? Would it be okay? My answer is, well, it's hard to answer that question because it's never going to happen. And the reason why it's never going to happen is because people will never one day all become psychopaths. If you look at the human condition, where we are, look on a bell curve. You could see that morality and ethics exist on a bell curve. I mean, most of us are right there on the top. Like, we're very ethical people, and some people are extremely ethical. And there's some people, like, according to recent numbers, maybe even 5% of the population, up to 5%, are sociopaths or even psychopaths. That means they have little to no empathy. So empathy is really the biological or genetic trait that we all have. And as human beings, we evolve with a relatively high level of empathy. That's not going to change. I mean, that's the way we evolve over hundreds of thousands of years. So never are we all going to decide one day that killing babies is okay. That's just not going to happen. But it doesn't mean that our moral views on certain issues will change over time. Like a good example is with homosexuality. Back before, I think in 1977, it may have been, it was technically a mental disorder that was in the DSM, the psychological book. So if you went to a psychologist and you were gay, well, you would maybe be put on medicine or something. That's the way it was. Why? It wasn't that way because we all thought it was right. It's just like that's what we knew at the time. But as we learn more information, as science tells us more about the human condition and we learn more, then we could take that new information, we could incorporate it into our beliefs, and therefore our morality will shift. And that's a good example where it has shifted. And now we say, oh, these people aren't possessed by Satan. It's just like a biological and environmental thing. And at least for those of us who are non-religious, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And then there's the next part of that, the democratic part, is you need these people in charge who know what they're talking about to be able to explain to other people these findings and to explain, look, here is why being gay is not wrong. And put out your best argument, backed up by science, backed up by data, backed up by personal examples. There's nothing wrong with personal examples or individual examples. And then based on that information, we have a shift in the overall morality, and something that was once very wrong maybe becomes very right. And it happened in a very short time, relatively speaking. So morality can shift like that, and it's okay. Now, if you say, well, wait a minute, Bo, are you saying that back in the 50s, being gay was wrong or was morally wrong? Well, yeah, according to the moral standards back then. And you could always put yourself in that situation. It's like, oh, if I was back there, I'd have no problem with it. But if I was back there in 1950, I would have the education and the knowledge of somebody in 1950 and all the social pressures of my peers from the 1950s. And I would probably say, yeah, burn them to the stake along with everybody else. So I'm not going to say that I'd be some wise sage back then saying the right thing, but that's the way morality works. Again, the reason that a lot of these people who like claim this objective morality that's unyielding, and objective is a funky word again, especially when we talk to morality, because people mean totally different things. But I would say that for the most part, if you're saying that something is right and it's always right, it always will be right from the beginning of time to the end of time, that's something that I generally don't buy. And if people that do claim that have a lot of explaining to do. So like, I haven't seen any kind of good excuse for that anyway. So that's kind of what I mean by the democratic version and the temporal, that morality does shift over time.
So that's the historian's fallacy, right?
Right. To put yourself back in a time and think that you know everything that you do now, which we don't.
Yeah. I think the perfect example of that is I don't know if you've come across this, but the happy Auschwitz guards. There's images of laughing at Auschwitz, SS auxiliaries pose at a resort for Auschwitz personnel in 1942. And it's just looking back at this, obviously we can say this is an atrocity, but when you're in the moment, these people don't necessarily always understand what's happening. There's 15 people in this photo. They're all smiling. They're all SS members. And it's absolutely a logical fallacy to believe that if you were transported back in time and took the body of somebody else that was living in 1938 Germany, that you would have had the ability to stand up and say, no, we can't do this.
Well, that gets into deep philosophy too. It's like, okay, if you jump back into somebody else's body, well, what part is you that's actually there? If you're in the biological body of somebody else with all of their memories, all of their knowledge, then again, you're resorting to the supernatural and you're saying there's some magical soul and you have this shining, bright, light soul that always knows the difference between right and wrong, which, let's face it, that's just not the case. If you're jumping back into some Nazi guard and you are them physically and you have their experiences, you are them. Full stop, right? And you would, by definition, do exactly what they do and feel and say exactly what they say.
Given the sort of, again, temporal and democratic nature of this, is it a naive question to ask that for a well-adjusted person that our perception of right and wrong is just correct? Or is that too reductive a statement?
I guess it depends how you define correct. Take any individual and ask, is their perception of right or wrong in line with social norms? You could ask that question, and then it's either yes or no. Like, so say somebody wants to kill babies.
Well-adjusted. I did say well-adjusted.
Okay, well-adjusted. All right. So say something a little bit less nefarious, like say you want to steal something from a store because you want to steal a drink from a store because you're just really thirsty. Some people would say, I'll just be really thirsty and suffer, and that's okay. And some people say, look, I'm really thirsty. That justifies me stealing this. There's an issue there that reasonable people could be arguing either way, whether one is morally justifiable or not. So that's where right or wrong becomes a little kind of old-fashioned in a way, because we're trying to use some kind of standard that we really don't uphold or we don't follow. So is it right? Well, it depends. Like, is it right for the situation? Is it right for the person? Maybe. You mentioned reasonable people, well-adjusted people could disagree and come to different conclusions. And I would just say that that's sort of one of the problems with morality, where if you don't have some magical person or magical book that tells you exactly everything that's right or wrong, we got to figure out these things on our own. And we have to argue and we have to debate. And I think we've got some of the best systems in the world, including the justice system, where maybe somebody could go on court. They could tell their story to a jury, a non-biased jury, and you could have a defense and you could have the plaintiffs, And you could argue everything out. And at the end of the day, there's going to be a decision made. And that's the best we got. That's what we got to do. And I do want to point out here that religion does not get off the hook one bit, because if there's any book in the world that is incredibly ambiguous and contradicting itself, it's the holy books, where you could, that's the way the books are written, where you have hundreds, maybe even thousands of authors that contributed this book with all different belief systems. So when you read something, you'll say, oh, like, for example, in Christianity, are we saved by our faith or are we saved by our works? Well, you could look at dozens of verses that say we're saved by faith and dozens that say we're saved by works. And you just basically pick what you like. There's no absolute final word on that. And then, of course, even if there were, let's say that there is just one thing in a holy book, well, then you got to say, well, who says that this holy book is the right one? You've got people all over the world that swear by other holy books. You got some people like Catholics who make up half the Christians who don't really care about the holy book. They care about the holy guy, the Pope, what he says. So who is right? So then you have that, who is the ultimate authority? And that's, who gets to pick that? So there are so many problems with traditional type of morality that when you adopt something more of, or the kind of morality that we're talking about, something that's humanistic based, something that's kind of based on science, something that realizes that the foundation of morality is ethics, is human ethics. And we're all pretty much at the same spot, with the outliers on the edges. Some people are extremely ethical and some people, like to a fault, and some people are extremely unethical, and we call them sociopaths and psychopaths. So that's where morality is. I'm pretty comfortable with where I am morally and what I figured out, and I think it's pretty good. I'd be happy to defend it.
So I think you touched on some important points there in religion, and I wrote a blog post back in November that I called The Logical Utility of Church and Religion. And the conclusion that I came to was that the wholesale adoption of ideas is bad. This is a general principle that I live by, but that we should still be able to incorporate good ideas wherever they come from. So the conclusion that I arrived at was that the book style religion was useful for its lessons and traditions that help progress human flourishing, and that the church was useful in that it's a means to an end of community and relationships. And I think we're pretty aligned on there. So I don't know that there's a question in there, but maybe the question there, given that we're talking about this non-wholesale adoption of ideas, is, do you have a method or a framework that you use in particular to help you parse apart different complex ideas, or something that you maybe don't see as the need for to be adopted wholesale? And how do you go about pulling those things apart?
So you're referring to maybe something we might read in the Bible, like whether it's a good story?
No, so just a more generalized question as far as if you're approached with a new idea and someone's coming to you and saying, I don't know, this is not a good example, the sky is red, or I have this new idea for a TV show that I think would really hit it off well, and I need your help pulling apart if this is going to be an effective use of time for me to spend time working on. In your life, is it just a strict critical thinking exercise? Is there steps that you go through, a framework that you use to help you arrive at an end goal when you're looking at being able to adopt particular ideas into your worldview?
Well, I know it's not a strict formula. I don't go through a checklist or anything like that, because there are so many different factors that come into play based on what I'm being told or what somebody's trying to sell me, in a sense. Like, what ideas, is it an opinion or somebody claiming something to be a fact? So those are two completely different processes, whether you're trying to accept opinion of somebody or a fact. And then you have everything else that comes into play, like with manipulation and deception and parsing all that out. There's a a lot of different processes that are involved in something like this. So I think it's more of just something that goes on in my head, kind of like subconsciously, when somebody does tell me an idea. One of the first things I think we all do is we look at the credibility of the person or of the source. So if we hear something from a news network that we typically don't like, or typically think that a lot of junk comes out of, we have this automatic aversion to it, and we don't accept it right away. And we're a lot more critical, whereas maybe it's our favorite news source and we hear something, then we automatically accept it. And that's what I was talking about before earlier about the cognitive energy you want to expend as less as possible, or we usually do. And it just kind of comes in and soaks in. So the best thing that we can do, one of the first steps, is when somebody does tell us an idea, when we hear something, kind of forget about the source. And I say kind of because the source is important. So for example, when I was growing up, we had something called the World Weekly News. I don't know if you remember that. It was basically a tabloid newspaper that had like aliens are running the White House, like pregnant lizards by humans. I mean, crazy, crazy stuff, like usually involved like Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, all that stuff. Most people saw that as entertainment, but some people actually really believe that stuff, my mom included. She loved that stuff and she would get really excited about it. But the point is, when it's a really good heuristic to look at the source, and because there's just so much stuff that's thrown on us on a regular basis, we can't possibly critically think and evaluate everything. So when we see something on a news site or a news periodical like the World Weekly News, we could pretty much automatically dismiss it. And 99.9% of the time, we'd be right, and that's okay. Likewise, if somebody that we typically don't trust or we know false information comes from this person on a constant basis, it's generally okay. It's a good heuristic to go ahead and just dismiss it as long as it's not like critical information that you really need. And so that's not too bad to do. But what we need to do is we need to keep more of an open mind for those sources that are kind of in the middle. You know, sometimes we don't like them. Sometimes they're okay. They're generally respectable sources or general respectable people, whatever. Those are the sources that we need to be a little bit more careful with, because that's when it gets dangerous, when we automatically reject or automatically accept based on a pretty decent source. So that's maybe one of the first things you can do.
I've heard this sort of, and a lot of this ties back to the political realm, unfortunately, that these clouds of ideas have been referred to in one of two ways. There's a video game streamer turned political commentator. His name's Destiny. I don't know if he came up with this idea or just I've heard him talk about it, is this constellation of ideas, and that only by accepting one of these can we then accept all the others. And I've heard it referred, another gentleman by the name of Malcolm Collins talks to it as if it's the idea that we're growing a tree of ideas, and that the trunk of the tree is some of the core beliefs that make up basically our identity, and then everything else sort of sprouts out from there. And then maybe the most recent thing is just this twig on the end of a branch over here. And it's easier to get rid of this new idea, but when we have ideas that challenge part of the core that make up our identity, it becomes a lot harder to be able to take those into consideration. I've heard you talk a little bit about trying to not be biased in any way, and obviously that's a lot easier said than done. But how can we, in what you're saying of taking in all of these ideas from different sources, do our best to treat information, if we are receiving it from a good source, as just as important to some of these twigs as it is to oftentimes or sometimes the trunk of our idea or belief about the world?
So the key is ideology. And you mentioned that word before, or form of it. If we have strong ideological beliefs, then we almost certainly will not be strong critical thinkers. That's because almost without fail, ideology always will trump our critical thinking. And our desire for the truth. It's really good to be in the position where you can look at two different sides and you could say, all right, I just want to know the truth. And one of the ways you could do that is by not identifying with an ideology. So for example, if you are like a proud Republican or a proud Democrat, then you're already at a major disadvantage. Not saying that either one of those may not be like a decent philosophy or a decent political stance or whatever, but well, there's many things wrong with it. One thing being Republicans aren't right on everything and Democrats aren't right on everything. And if you strongly associate with one of those two parties, then what you're doing is you're basically setting yourself up for just rejecting like any ideas that come from the other. And you're just adopting the ideas that support your ideology as opposed to those ideas that are right or those facts that are right. So if you could be in the position where you say, look, I'm an independent and maybe I might vote one way a majority of the time, but just that fact, just stating like you're independent, you are setting your identity to basically nothing, like something in the middle. That it doesn't mean that you take some ideas here, some ideas there. You could take all the ideas of one party if you want, but that's the beautiful thing. As somebody who doesn't associate with an ideology or a label like that, you have the freedom of doing that. And then the next day you have the freedom of throwing all that away and taking all the ideas from the other side if you want. And it gets even more dicey when you identify with a religion, because unlike a political party, where you could, at least here in the United States, you could switch political parties all you want and you're not going to get shot or killed or like nothing terrible is going to happen to you. You may lose some friends and talk to family members, but for the most part, it's not disastrous. Whereas like with religion, people have strong beliefs. If you abandon that religion, then you're going to spend eternity in hell. I mean, that's one of the core principles of the largest religion in this country. So you could see that the desire for that to be right, what we call motivated reasoning, is so strong that if you believe that one core belief, and that may be what you're talking about, like the trunk of the tree, like I will burn in hell forever if I'm not a Christian or if I give up this belief, then everything else from that, you just kind of have to subscribe to the party line and you have to believe all these things because frankly, and you could speak with so many different atheists or former Christians, mostly former Christians, you will see that once you start questioning things and critically thinking about some of the smaller issues, things that really don't matter much. It's kind of a big one, but is the world 6,000 years old? No. Well, wait a minute. If Adam and Eve weren't real people, why did Jesus write about them as if they were? And then you start questioning all that stuff. And wait, did saints really come out of the graves and start walking around town? Those are zombies. I've never seen that happen. Maybe that's not true. When you start questioning all these things, these dominoes start to fall apart and then they start to like go down the tree to the trunk. And then people are in like an intellectual crisis in a way where they don't know what to believe anymore. And their whole foundation of what they thought they knew kind of fell apart. It's good to be in a position where you could say, hey, some people call it agnosticism, like being an agnostic, but I don't think that's a thing in terms of, I believe you could either believe in a God or not. So you're either an atheist or you're not, or you're a believer or you're not. It's not like, I think agnosticism is more of, I don't know, but I don't think anybody knows. And I think the people who do say, oh, I definitely know for sure, they're saying that, that's part of like reaffirming their faith. But I think everybody to some extent is agnostic in that point. But being in the position where you're not held hostage to any of these foundational beliefs, and I'm proud to be in that position. Like if like the sky opened up and a God came down and told me all about himself, okay, sure. Whatever, I'll just follow the evidence and I'm okay with that. And I think that's a really good position intellectually to be in. Be in that position where, hey, show me the evidence and wherever the evidence leads, I will follow. That's being intellectually honest and not being held hostage to any of these ideologies.
What part of social psychology is being ignored by the media but will be studied by historians?
I think mostly the art of persuasion, manipulation. Persuasion obviously is the more positive aspect. You could persuade people, and usually when we use the word persuasion, we talk about like some kind of positive element. We persuade people to take better care of their health, to donate their organs, things like that. Whereas manipulation, that's more of the negative. We can manipulate people through our words and our actions, and there are hundreds of different techniques that people use to manipulate. And I don't think that the media or just the general public is very aware of this. And I think we're all kind of playing useful idiots in that we can be manipulated. And this isn't some grand conspiracy theory. I mean, this is just psychology 101, where people who want us to do something for them use manipulation. I mean, salespeople do it. Religious leaders do it who want our money. Politicians do it who want our votes. There's no real secret here besides the fact that this is being done. Like, people who know it, and people who don't know it just either don't care or they don't know about it enough. Like, they're not being told enough about these techniques. And that's the interesting thing. Once you start learning these techniques, once you start learning cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and just general manipulation techniques, then you start to see them everywhere. And I like to use the analogy. It's kind of like that scene in The Matrix where the guy's looking at the monitor and you see all the green crap lines coming down. And he's like, oh, I don't see that. I see the beautiful women. I see this. Because you could just see through all the code and you could see what the code actually means. So in our example, in this metaphor, the code is the words that we use and maybe even the actions we take. But the real message is what's really underneath those words. And that's our desire, what we want people to do and how we change our words to get people to do those things.
So this has been used a lot more than people would like to hope that it has been used in the last sort of 4 years or so. I know you wrote a whole blog article on pro-social manipulation. And I think an end point that we've sort of reached at this point, in that the probable pro-social manipulation has led to a sort of lack of institutions at this point. So there is this has gone too far kind of moment for some people. And the easiest example I can think of here is however you want to talk about it, the idea that some of the information that we received about the vaccines may not have been upheld to the highest standard of care. And as such, in Canada now, there's a large pushback, and the uptick in parents refusing the regular vaccine schedule for their kids has gone up, and we're seeing increases in cases of stuff that we haven't seen in 50 to 100 years. And I guess, to your point, how can we be more aware of these pressures and this manipulation that people have or are attempting to get us to be useful idiots? How can we stop being useful idiots?
Well, I want to go back for 1 second and just reiterate your example you used, because it's a perfect example of what I termed pro-social manipulation. Pro-social manipulation is manipulating people, deceiving people using those different techniques, persuading them in a way, but for pro-social reasons. So it's kind of, you've got two words that really don't go together, pro-social and manipulation. Why isn't it just persuasion? Well, because it is manipulation. And the key here is, and you hit on it with the vaccines, you can manipulate people and you could change the narrative. And for the good of society, you could believe that you were doing the right thing. Okay, wait a minute. If we kind of just maybe exaggerate these death numbers a little bit, if we show really scary stories of young people dying, if we kind of just bump up the efficacy of the vaccines a little bit, show some good examples. I'm not saying all of this has been done. Maybe some of it has, But you get the point. Like if you just make it sound a little bit better, and if you make it sound like masks are a lot more effective than they really are, then more people will wear them. And we know that they have some efficacy. So that's a good thing. So overall, we're saving lives. So you're manipulating, you're deceiving, you're using deception, you're using even propaganda maybe in order to do something that you really believe is good for society. Now, the big problem here is who gets to decide what is really good for society? Who gets to make this decision? And we may be able to see the short-term benefits, like, hey, look at that. 5% fewer people died because we really exaggerated all of these effects and people are scared. So people are staying in more. They're not going out. But what we didn't foresee is like the economy crashing, inflation going crazy. And like you mentioned, people kind of looking back on this in retrospect and saying, oh, that wasn't really that true. Therefore, they're lying to us. Therefore, every other vaccine is a bunch of crap, and I'm not going to take any vaccines or give my kids any. And now, like you mentioned, we've got kids getting polio and these diseases that have been eradicated for almost a century. And just other common diseases like measles, mumps, rubella that have seen a huge spike. And like all of these negative effects come from this one thing that was kind of pro-social. There was good intent behind it, but they didn't foresee what could happen in the future. That's why I'm a strong believer that pro-social manipulation is not good, because there's no way we could see that stuff. So now to your question, which was, how can we kind of foresee this? Well, we really can't. It's like if we looked at all the scientific literature, which I did back then, and you look at all the cases, what respectable sources like Johns Hopkins was putting out. And then you could look at what other people are putting out, like the conspiracy sites, go ahead and see that as well. You make a decision, you make a judgment. And what it comes down to is if you're in a position where you really don't know what's true, you have to resort to, well, I trust Johns Hopkins much more than I trust, right, Alex Jones. And then you also have to look at the pros and cons. You could say, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong and let's say the masks aren't as effective as I thought they were? Well, that means I just wore a mask when I really didn't need to. But what if they're right and they really are effective? Well, I could potentially save my life or save the life of somebody else. So you look at the pros and the cons. And for me, it was a no-brainer. It's like, well, yeah, let's play it safe. And I really do believe the world governments were playing that card. They were saying, whoa, this is a totally new thing. We don't know what's going on here. We have no idea how dangerous this is going to be. No idea where it's going to lead, if it's going to mutate. I mean, you remember, that wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was really scary. So you have to play it safe. And if there are some numbers, multiple studies come out, and one study supports like vaccines or the mask efficacy more, then you kind of go with that one, not because you want to trick people, you want to deceive people, but because it's kind of the best course of action to take, because the risk of being wrong is a lot more damaging than if you're right. So that's it. I mean, it's difficult to tell. You just do the best you can, and don't try to be a contrarian. I think a lot of people will cling to any one piece of misinformation that maybe Johns Hopkins or some other respectable establishment got wrong or wasn't quite right about it, and then say, therefore, they're wrong about everything. Therefore, I'm going to ignore everything. And that's just going way too far.
Yeah, I think there's this sort of melting pot of a couple ideas. This whole, how do we get to decide who knows what's best? And the idea that people need to have trust in institutions because it's completely unfeasible for the majority of people to be able to do any reasonable amount of their own research to have an intelligent take on a particular subject.
Yeah. And people confuse, again, research with Googling, and they think, oh, I've done my own research. No, you didn't. That's not research. Stop it.
I guess what I am just trying to communicate here is it becomes so dangerous to use these forms of pro-social manipulation when people find out that they've been quote unquote lied to or nudged in one direction, and then they completely swing the other direction because it's a natural human tendency to not like being lied to in particular.
Sure.
And I don't know if I have there's no question to follow this up. I'm just trying to mull this idea over in my head, and it's something that I've been thinking about obviously for the last 4 years or so, in that I don't know how to be a bastion of the good information and know that what I'm talking about is everyone wants to hope they're on the right side of history, and obviously people are going to be proportionally on one side or the other in something, and I guess in aggregate you just hope you come out more on the correct side, I guess.
Well, let me give you some good advice here. And here's pretty much the bottom line and kind of a philosophy that I stick with. It's better to be wrong for the right reason than it is to be right for the wrong reason. And what I mean by that is, if something like COVID happens and you follow all of the best literature from Harvard Medical School, from Johns Hopkins, all the other universities that research, that have the best people in the world, and not just United States organizations, in case you're thinking it's some American conspiracy, but you have a consensus from all over the world of the top universities. Where else do you go for advice about this? You know, people are looking at like, I'm not going to believe in that stuff because my politician told me that it's all nonsense, so I'm going to believe them. Why in the world would you believe them? The people who have the best information, again, it's the best information. This is the way science works. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be right. It means that probabilistically, it's the best information. These people who study this, who are virologists, do this for a living for the past 30, 40 years. These are the people to trust. And if they happen to be wrong, especially on some issue, and I followed them, then I am wrong for the right reason. Yeah, sure, because I believed what they believed, because they are the experts. They are the best people in the world to trust on this issue. And will I be wrong sometimes? Will they be wrong sometimes? Yes. And that's okay. But what if you followed somebody like Alex Jones, and who's like a crazy guy who says all these crazy conspiracies, and one of the conspiracies that he says happens to be true? And then you said, yeah, see, well, you're still an idiot. You just happen to be an idiot that's right that one time. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about the process of how you get information and how you accept information. So if you are listening to some YouTuber who yells on the microphone about a certain issue, which kind of sounds like me right now, but then that's probably not the best idea. You listen to certain experts in their field and you take their advice, then you're going to be right for the right reason. And more importantly, you're going to be right far more often than you would be if you listen to somebody else. It's not the expert on that situation.
Part of your branding is using critical thinking, reasoning, and science-based approaches to issues that matter. And this is something that I've been playing around with myself more recently, actually, last 3 to 6 months or so, is how do I know what issues matter? And maybe more importantly, how do I know what issues matter to me and not that I'm adopting issues that culture tells me I'm supposed to think matter?
There's not a big difference between the two, because what matters to you is probably what culture tells you. Like, for example, if you're probably not going to automatically feel passionate about some species that's going extinct in the jungles of the Amazon, it's probably not going to happen because that's not part of your culture. You're not there. You're not involved in maybe in scientists who study that part of the world or whatever. But if you were, then you would be educated about that and you would understand about it. And then you'd get some kind of empathetic feeling towards that cause, and it would matter to you then. So I don't think there's much wrong with the idea that culture tells you that's something you should care about. I think that's okay only if you believe it, not if you say you care about it because culture tells you, therefore you're trying to just kind of be a good guy and do what culture tells you, do what other people tell you. And when it comes to like all of the possible issues out there, which there are millions that you could be passionate about, or people could try to tell you to be passionate about, it's a better way of putting it. Don't. I mean, be passionate about what you're passionate about. Almost certainly everybody will come across like one or two issues in their lifetime. Yeah, this means a lot to me and I'm going to focus on that. And if you focus on that one thing, that is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And don't let people bully you into telling you that you should be passionate about this issue. You should care about this issue. Because again, with millions of issues, there is no possible way that we could all be passionate about all million issues. And everybody thinks that their issue is the most important. That's just the way human nature is. And just understand that. And be happy if you're passionate about something and you're working towards one issue. If you haven't found any issues, then maybe you should start looking.
I have one final question that I ask all my guests, and it's very relevant to this idea of critical thinking that we've been talking about for the last hour. And what's the last opinion or belief that you changed your mind about?
At least the major one that I'm thinking of right now is when I was a member of the American Humanist Association. And that's the association supposed to focus on people being the center of the philosophy with no supernatural, no magical claims or whatnot. And in my time, which is probably maybe like 5 years in that organization, it did a radical shift from what I started with, which is basically just like a religious-based, a human-centered, do-good type of philosophy, to something that became extremely political, picking up like every social issue of the day. And the worst part about it is it was abandoning scientific principles. And if science like disagreed with something, it didn't care. It was all about like the social issues, and it became extremely political. And I said, I'm out of there. So my views towards humanism, at least the American Humanist Association, was very positive at one point, and then it became very negative. And now I just don't care at all about it.
Bo, I love it. I love your work, and I think we need more critical thinkers in the world. If people want to check out your stuff, where can we send them?
Well, my personal site, everything we've been talking about, you can go to bennett.com. That's where you'll find all my books about many of the topics we were talking about. And if you're interested in the business stuff, what I'm doing, check out archieboy.com. That's where you'll find all my links to my businesses.
Perfect. Thank you very much for joining me, and I appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me this afternoon.
All right, Blake. Thank you so much. Good talking.